A U.S. Air Force E-3 Sentry AWACS was damaged in an Iranian missile and drone strike at Prince Sultan Air Base on March 27. That is not just another aircraft on a runway. It is one of the platforms built to see the fight, organize the fight, and hold the air picture together while everything else is moving at combat speed. At the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama, Bahrain, an Iranian one-way attack drone struck a radome tied to the communications architecture of the base. That kind of target is not chosen for spectacle. It is chosen because somebody wants to interfere with how the force talks, coordinates, and shares awareness across a live battle space. In Jordan, the radar for an American TAAD battery was struck and apparently destroyed in the opening days of the war. That means one of the systems built to detect and support interception was hit before most people had even processed what kind of conflict this was becoming. Once that happens, this stops looking like random blowback and starts looking like a hunt. You're not here for the press briefing version of this war. You're here for the layer underneath it. So subscribe now and tell me in the comments what this looks like to you. Retaliation, or the deliberate stalking of the nervous system behind American Airpower. This is why U.S. Airpower keeps taking hits. Iran is not mainly chasing the part of American power you are supposed to admire on camera. It is going after the systems behind it, the radars that warn, the SATCOM that connects, the tankers that stretch reach, and the AWACS that turn separate aircraft into one operating mind. That is the real quick answer. And it has to be said early because everything else in this story hangs off it. The jets are the visible layer. The network behind the jets is the real layer of power. And that is the layer that keeps showing up on the target list. 2 weeks before the AWS was hit, 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes were struck and damaged on the ground at the same Saudi base. That is what makes Prince Sultan so revealing. First, the aircraft that extends range gets hit. Then the aircraft that extends awareness gets hit. That is not battlefield chaos. That is target selection. Once those two moments lock together, the whole story changes shape. A tanker is not glamorous, but it is what keeps fighters where they need to be. An AWACS is not cinematic, but it is what makes the rest of the force coherent. Hit both, and you are not just scoring damage. You are reaching into the machinery of air power itself. And that is exactly how a weaker actor is supposed to think. If you cannot win a clean air war against the strongest visible layer, you stop worshipping the visible layer. You start studying the dependencies under it. That is why this story is more dangerous than the average strike video makes it look. It is not only about whether something blew up. It is about whether the architecture behind U.S. power is being mapped, understood, and deliberately thinned out one function at a time. Since February 28th, radar systems, satellite communications, and mission-critical aircraft have been struck at least 7 U.S. bases across Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. That one pattern tells you more than 20 speeches ever will. Different objects, different bases, same logic. Go after the connective tissue that lets us Airpower operate as a network instead of a collection of isolated platforms. And that SATCOM piece cannot be treated like technical wallpaper. If SATCOM starts getting hunted, the war is moving straight into the command layer. It is moving into the realm of timing, data flow, coordination, and whether the force still shares one trusted picture or starts living inside fragments. That is why the Bahrain strike matters so much. A hit on a communications node does not create the same instant emotional reaction as a burning aircraft. But strategically, it can be nastier than that. A force can survive damage and still fight. What it cannot do comfortably is fight while its internal connections are being stressed. Once you make the war about stress connections, you do not need perfect success to change the campaign. You only need enough disruption to make every next decision slower, dirtier, and more expensive. You only need enough pressure to make the stronger side spend more of its energy protecting the hidden layer instead of projecting the visible one. In the first 2 weeks of the war, strikes on military bases used by the United States in the Middle East were estimated to have caused about 800 metamins in damage. That number is not just about money. It is about repair cycles, replacement pressure, shifting coverage, and the growing burden on whatever assets are still available to patch the holes. The clean part of war is the accounting. The dirty part is time. A damaged radar can mean a thinner warning picture. A damaged communications node can mean more friction in coordination. A damaged support aircraft can mean less flexibility. Tomorrow even, if the force still looks powerful tonight, This is where official reassurance starts hiding more than it reveals. Publicly, the language is always about posture, defense, readiness, and deterrence. Quietly, the real question is nastier. How much compensating is now required just to keep the campaign looking normal? Because compensation is a kind of confession. More aircraft moved, more assets repositioned, more defensive layers leaned on harder. All of that can project strength, and sometimes it is strength. But it also means the war is already extracting payment from the less visible parts of the system. On the Yemen front, Houthi rebels shot down 7 U.S. Reaper drones in less than 6 weeks, wiping out more than 200 meters in aircraft, built for surveillance, targeting, and persistence. Those losses are not side noise. They strip away a layer of watching and tracking that a force relies on to keep pressure steady over time. And again, the same theme appears. The platform changes. The battlefield changes. The actor on the other side changes. But the effect stays familiar. The ability to watch continuously gets hit. The ability to sustain presence gets hit. The ability to keep one live picture over hostile ground gets hit. That is why it is a mistake to read this as one clean US-Iran story and one separate Houthi story. In functional terms, the same American ecosystem keeps getting stressed at the same kinds of pressure points. The result is not one giant cinematic collapse. It is repeated abrasion against the intelligence, warning, and support layer of US power. And that is exactly the kind of war that drains confidence slowly while preserving enough outward strength to keep official messaging upbeat. From the outside, the machine still looks enormous. From the inside, the maintenance burden keeps climbing. By the time analysts were openly describing Iran as going after the radars that detect threats, the tankers that keep jets flying, and the AWACS that direct the battle, the logic had become impossible to ignore. That is why the phrase counter-air campaign matters so much here. It means the damage is lining up around how US air power actually functions, not around random opportunities. Now, that does not mean every claim from every side should be swallowed raw. Iran has every reason to dramatize its success. Washington has every reason to minimize operational pain. But the beauty of a real target pattern is that it can survive propaganda from both directions. If the same kinds of enabling assets keep appearing in the strike record, the story becomes bigger than what either side says. It starts telling you what the war is selecting for. And what this war keeps selecting for is the less glamorous but more essential layer beneath the fighters. That is why the safest version of this story is also the dumbest version of this story. Bases were attacked is technically true and strategically useless. The real sentence is harsher. The hidden support architecture of US air power is being treated like a battlefield in its own right. For generations, dedicated sensing and battle management aircraft have played the quarterback role, turning separate sorties into one coordinated force. That is why an E3 Sentry being damaged matters beyond the price tag. Lose a quarterback and the team is still on the field, but the timing gets worse, the awareness gets thinner, and the margin for error gets brutally smaller. That is also where the human anchor in this story really sits. Inside those aircraft are battle managers, whose job is to turn noise into order. They are the people who take a chaotic sky and make it usable for everyone else. They exist so pilots do not have to fight blind, guess wrong, or waste precious seconds building a picture on their own. So when a platform like that gets hit, the loss is not only metal, circuitry, and budget. The loss is a moving pocket of certainty. In war, certainty is its own weapon, and the enemy does not have to kill all of it to make the rest of the force feel the difference. That is why this title is stronger than it first sounds. It is not saying US aircraft are weak. It is saying the systems that help those aircraft stay dominant are now being hunted. That is a much more serious claim, and the evidence supports it more than many people are comfortable admitting. Missile defense radars across the Middle East have been repeatedly targeted, including some of the most prized radar systems in the regional architecture. Once that happens, warning time itself becomes contested terrain. The issue is no longer only whether incoming missiles can be intercepted. The issue is whether the force sees enough, early enough, to keep the rest of the shield working the way it was designed to work. And radar warfare is ugly precisely because it does not need full destruction to be meaningful. A radar can be degraded, pressured, or forced into disruption, and still change the entire downstream logic of the fight. It can shrink confidence, compress reaction time, and push commanders into less comfortable fallback arrangements. Radars are also perfect targets for an adapted strategy like this. They are expensive. They are high value. They are often static or semi-static. And they matter so much that even partial damage can trigger disproportionate operational anxiety. That is the kind of exchange a weaker actor wants. It wants to spend cheaper weapons against expensive certainty. It wants the other side to keep paying more to restore a picture that used to feel routine. Even after major strikes, senior U.S. military leadership was still warning that Iran retained considerable tactical capabilities. That cuts straight through the fantasy that pressure automatically equals control. If those tactical capabilities are still enough to threaten support aircraft, radar systems, and communications architecture, then the system under attack is still very much in the fight. And that is where the information war gets exposed. Falling launch numbers sound comforting. Defensive deployments sound orderly. High interception rates sound like dominance. But none of those things erase the possibility that the attacks still getting through are the ones being spent with the most care. In other words, fewer attacks does not necessarily mean a simpler threat. It can mean a more selective one. It can mean the war is moving from raw volume towards smarter allocation against the enablers that matter most. That is the moment the viewer is supposed to feel in the gut before the halfway point, and it is the moment mainstream framing often softens. Something has already gone wrong beneath the headlines. The war is not just punishing exposed bases. It is probing whether the hidden operating system behind U.S. Airpower can be made brittle. The U.S. response included moving large numbers of refueling aircraft and strengthening its air posture for potentially sustained operations. That is a show of readiness, but it is also a sign of burden. When more support aircraft have to be surged into the theater, the war is already demanding more from the very layer that keeps everything else alive. So even the buildup tells a double story. Yes, it projects power, but it also reveals strain. The more a force has to reinforce the backstage, the more clearly you can see where the enemy thinks the pressure will hurt. And that brings us to the hardest version of the answer. U.S. Airpower keeps taking hits because this is no longer only a contest over aircraft in the sky. It is a contest over whether the support spine behind those aircraft can survive being studied, mapped, and deliberately attacked. If this is a fully deliberate counter-air strategy, then Iran has already shown a blueprint for how a weaker actor can degrade American airpower without needing to win the sky outright. And if some of the public narrative around these attacks is inflated, the deeper conclusion still survives because the verified strike pattern already proves the vulnerability. The jets can still fly, the crews can still fight, the defenses can still intercept. But once the radars, SATCOM, tankers, and AWACS become part of the kill chain, air superiority stops beginning with the fighter and starts beginning with whether the hidden architecture behind the fighter is still alive. That is the part governments hate being forced to admit. A burning aircraft is dramatic, but a hunted network is worse. A hunted network means the enemy is no longer guessing where your strength lives. So the image to carry out of this video is not just the wrecked aircraft on the runway. It is the realization that the brain, the eyes, the links, and the lifeline are now targets in their own right. And once a war reaches that layer, it stops being a story about isolated strikes and becomes a story about whether the whole system can keep functioning under intelligent pressure. Stay close. This channel follows the war, where the official version starts getting uncomfortable.